Denver, 1994. A young police officer leaves home for his night shift, but he never makes it back. Hours later, his patrol car is found on a quiet street, the engine still running, the radio still on, the driver's seat empty, the officer is gone. For years, his family begs for answers. Whispers spread through the city. Did he run away? Did someone silence him? Or was the danger closer than anyone thought? Then 8 years later, workers demolishing an old barn outside Denver strike something buried deep in the dirt. At first it looks like trash, but then cloth, buttons, a badge. It's his uniform. What they uncover inside that barn shocks everyone and reveals a betrayal no one expected. Before we dive in, make sure to hit like and subscribe, because this story is about to take a chilling turn. And tell me in the comments, have you ever seen something with your own eyes that felt straight out of a true crime story? Share your experience below. In 1994, Denver was a busy city, but for one young police officer, life felt steady and full of purpose. He was only 24 years old, but he already wore his badge with pride. He believed in protecting people, and his family saw how much it meant to him. At home, he was the center of the family. His mom loved to brag about him. His dad told neighbors how proud he was that his son wore the uniform. His younger siblings looked up to him like a hero. To them, he wasn't just a cop. He was the big brother who played basketball in the driveway and fixed broken bikes on the weekends. Every morning he followed the same routine: coffee in the kitchen, a quick bite of toast. Then he'd check his uniform, carefully tucking in his shirt, polishing his badge, and lacing his boots tight. He treated every detail like it mattered because it did. At the station, fellow officers noticed his energy. He was young but determined, always the first to step forward when a tough call came in. He didn't just see this as a job, he saw it as a duty. His life seemed steady, safe, and full of promise, but all of it was about to change. On the night of his disappearance, everything felt normal. He came home from a short nap, grabbed his jacket, and got ready for the evening shift. His mother noticed how sharp he looked in his uniform, the same way she always did. She teased him about working too hard, and he just smiled. Before leaving, he bent down to hug his youngest sister. She asked when he'd be back, and he told her the same thing he always said: tomorrow morning. Those words would stay with her for the rest of her life. He picked up his car keys from the counter, gave his mom a quick kiss on the cheek, and told his dad he'd see him later. His dad nodded, proud but also tired from a long day at work. Neither of them knew this would be the last time. The officer stepped out into the cool Denver night. The street was quiet. The porch light glowed as he walked down to his car. He opened the door, tossed his jacket onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. The car slowly pulled away from the driveway. Inside the house, his family moved on with their evening, expecting to see him again in just a few hours. But he would never make it to the station. This simple goodbye was the last memory they ever had of him. At 7:00 a.m., the Denver police station buzzed like usual. Officers shuffled in, grabbed coffee, and joked about weekend plans. Roll call was routine. Everyone lined up, names called out, heads nodded. But when the sergeant called his name, there was no answer. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe he was running late. Maybe traffic had slowed him down. He was never late, but everyone has one of those days. Minutes passed. His partner checked the clock. The sergeant frowned and called his name again. Still nothing. That uneasy silence grew heavier. They tried his radio. No response. They dialed his pager. Nothing. That was strange. He was known for being reliable, the type of officer who followed every rule by the book. If something had delayed him, he would have reported it. The chatter in the room faded. A few officers glanced at each other, worry in their eyes. The jokes stopped. The air felt colder. By 7:20, people were no longer thinking late. They were thinking something worse. The sergeant gave an order: find his unit now. What started as routine had turned into alarm. Their officer, one of their own, had vanished before the day had even begun. Patrol units spread across Denver, scanning streets where he might be. They checked usual routes, alleys, parking lots. No sign. Then at 8:03 a.m., a call crackled over the radio. "We've got his cruiser." It was parked on a quiet street near downtown. At first glance, it looked fine, but as officers approached, their stomachs tightened. The engine was still running. The red and blue lights were off, but the soft hum of the motor filled the silence. The driver's door stood slightly open. His hat rested on the seat. The radio inside kept crackling with static. It was as if he had stepped out for a moment and never came back. Officers circled the car, scanning the area. No broken glass. No signs of a fight. Just an empty street and a police cruiser idling like a ghost. One officer leaned in and whispered, "Where the hell is he?" They checked nearby buildings, knocked on doors, asked passers-by. Nobody had seen anything. Back at the cruiser, the details felt haunting. His coffee cup sat half-finished in the holder. The shift log lay open on the dashboard, pen clipped neatly to the page. Everything suggested normal, except the man himself was gone. Word spread fast. More units arrived, sirens cutting through the morning air. Soon, supervisors were on scene. The sight chilled them all. Police don't just vanish. Yet here was the proof. A car still running, a radio alive, but no officer. By noon, whispers of kidnapping, ambush, or worse filled the department. The case had started, and it was darker than anyone imagined. By early afternoon, the entire Denver Police Department was on edge. Word of the missing officer spread from squad room to squad room, and what started as whispers turned into open panic. Cops weren't supposed to vanish. They were the ones people called when others disappeared. But now, one of their own had simply melted into thin air. At first, the brass tried to keep things calm. "We're looking into it. Stay focused," supervisors said. But the unease was impossible to hide. Everyone could feel it. In the break room, an officer slammed his fist on the table. "This doesn't happen by accident," he growled. Another muttered, "What if someone's hunting cops?" Nobody laughed. Nobody brushed it off. The sight of his cruiser, still running with the door cracked open, played over in their minds. It was like a ghost story come to life. Officers replayed every possible scenario: an ambush, a setup, maybe even betrayal. But the truth was worse. They had no idea. Detectives were assigned to retrace every step of his morning. They checked dispatch logs, traffic cameras, payphones, even the corner store near the street where the cruiser sat. But there were no answers, only silence. In the main office, phones rang nonstop. Tips came in, most useless. A few citizens claimed to have seen him, but every lead collapsed within hours. The case file grew thicker by the minute, but inside the station, what grew even faster was fear. Cops who normally showed steel nerves now looked over their shoulders. They double-checked their gear, their radios, their weapons. One veteran officer whispered what many feared to say out loud: "If someone can take him, they can take any of us." That thought spread like wildfire. Patrolmen no longer trusted the quiet streets they drove. Every parked car looked suspicious. Every dark alley felt like a trap. The department called in state police for help. Federal agents quietly observed. But even with more eyes, nothing made sense. By nightfall, the police department felt different. The badge, once a symbol of safety, now carried a shadow. The officer was gone, and for the first time, his brothers and sisters in blue wondered if someone out there was watching them too. At home, his family sat by the phone, waiting. They told themselves he was late, caught on a call, maybe working overtime. But as hours passed, that hope started to crack. The knock came just after dinner. Two officers stood at the door, hats in hand, faces grim. His wife's stomach dropped. She didn't need words, she knew something was wrong. "His car was found," one of them said softly. "He wasn't in it." The words felt like a punch. His wife staggered back. His children stared, confused, not fully understanding. The room fell silent except for the sound of her breathing, sharp and uneven. They asked questions. Where was he? Was he hurt? Did someone take him? The officers didn't have answers. All they could say was that the department was searching. The family clung to denial. He was strong, smart, trained. He knew how to survive. Maybe he'd been called somewhere urgent. Maybe he'd turn up at any moment, walking through the door with that tired smile. But as the night dragged on, denial turned into dread. The phone rang constantly, relatives, friends, neighbors asking for updates. She had none. By midnight, his wife sat by the window, staring at the streetlight, praying to see headlights in the driveway. His children fell asleep on the couch, clutching pillows. Every creak of the house, every passing car made her jump. Fear wrapped around her like chains. That night marked the beginning of a nightmare. A family waiting, hopping, but knowing deep inside something was terribly wrong. By nightfall, the city looked like a war zone. Helicopters thumped overhead, their spotlights cutting across rooftops and alleys. Sirens wailed in the distance. Every available officer was called in. Denver was on full alert. Search dogs sniffed along sidewalks, their handlers yanking the leashes tight as they pulled toward shadows and fences. Dozens of flashlights bobbed through parks and empty lots. Neighbors stood on porches in their pajamas, watching silently, fear written on their faces. The missing officer's name echoed across police radios. Units checked block after block. Abandoned buildings were forced open, warehouses searched, dumpsters overturned. Every corner of downtown was lit up by red and blue lights. Detectives pounded on doors. Did you see anyone? Did you hear anything? But most answers were the same: nothing. A few claimed they spotted him near another car, but details clashed. Was it a sedan, a truck? Which color? No two stories matched. At one point, a dog barked wildly near a drainage ditch. Officers rushed in, hearts pounding. They pulled aside debris, crawled through mud, shining flashlights into the dark tunnel. But it was empty, just wet concrete and silence. From the air, the city looked covered in moving stars, every beam of light chasing one goal. Yet, hour by hour, the search came up empty. Inside the command post, tension was rising. A huge map of Denver was plastered on the wall, red pins marking searched zones. The whiteboard filled with scribbled leads and crossed-out notes. The more they wrote, the more hopeless it looked. By 3 a.m., fatigue set in. Officers leaned against squad cars, sweat and dirt on their uniforms. Some lit cigarettes, staring blankly into the night. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The trail was cold. Still, no one wanted to quit. They kept moving, shining flashlights into alleys, rattling locked gates, peering into parked cars. The missing officer's family sat awake at home, glued to the news. Helicopter shots showed sweeping searchlights over the city. His mother pressed her hand against the TV screen, whispering, "Find him." But the hours kept slipping away. Every minute made the chances smaller. When dawn finally broke, the city was quiet again. The helicopters landed. The dogs were led back to their kennels. Officers trudged home, eyes hollow. They had searched an entire city, and yet they found nothing, not a trace, not a clue, only a growing, terrifying question. How could an officer vanish so completely, in the middle of Denver, with the whole world watching? By the next morning, Denver looked different. Everywhere people turned, his face stared back at them. Detectives and volunteers hit the streets with stacks of flyers. Each one showed his photo in uniform, young, smiling, proud. The bold words screamed, "Missing officer." Posters were taped to bus stops. They were pinned on store windows. Schools put them on bulletin boards. Coffee shops stuck them to doors. Even light poles and fences were plastered with his picture. Detectives knew this had to be loud. A missing officer wasn't just another case. It was a crisis. Someone out there had to have seen something, and these flyers were their net to catch it. People on the street stopped to look. Some shook their heads, whispering, "That's the officer who used to wave at traffic." Others muttered, "If they can take a cop, who's safe?" The department's phones rang nonstop. Most calls were nothing: false alarms, confused tips, mistaken identities. But every tip was logged, checked, and followed. Detectives refused to ignore anything. By nightfall, the city felt covered in his image. Everywhere someone walked, there he was on paper, staring back, silently asking to be found. For the family, it was almost unbearable. His mother cried seeing strangers walk by his face like it was just another poster. To her, he wasn't a symbol. He was her son. And now, his smile had become Denver's greatest mystery. The story hit the news within hours. By the second day, it was everywhere. Local TV stations broke into regular programming with updates. Anchors sat at their desks, looking grave. Tonight, a Denver police officer is missing. His car was found, engine running, but the officer himself has vanished. Newspapers printed his face on the front page. Where is he? The headlines screamed. Radio hosts took calls from angry citizens who demanded answers. Cameras swarmed the police station. Reporters crowded the steps, shoving microphones at every officer who walked out. Is this a kidnapping? Is Denver safe? Was he targeted? The questions came rapid fire, and the department had few answers. Every detail, no matter how small, was reported. What street his cruiser was found on. What time he should have arrived at roll call. Even what he had eaten that morning became a news flash. People across the city tuned in, glued to updates. At work, TVs were left on in break rooms. In diners, strangers argued over theories. Some said he must have been ambushed. Others whispered he staged it himself. The case wasn't just police business anymore. It had become Denver's obsession. Detectives fanned out across Denver block by block. They started where the cruiser had been found. Apartment complexes, small houses, corner stores, every door was a possible clue. An officer knocked on a rusty metal door. Did you see a police officer last night? Did you hear anything unusual? Inside, a woman shook her head. No, nothing. Next door, a man said he thought he heard a car door slam around midnight. Another neighbor said they saw flashing lights, but couldn't tell if it was a police car or just headlights bouncing off glass. None of it lined up. Detectives filled their notebooks with scraps, vague times, uncertain faces, half-remembered details. The frustration grew with each stop. One officer sighed as another door closed. Hundreds of people live around here, and somehow no one saw him disappear. They widened the search. Gas stations, diners, bars, officers slid his photo across counters. You recognize him? Some shook their heads. A few hesitated, squinting at the picture, but then said no. Back at the command post, the list of interviews stretched long, but the answers were thin. Door after door, the city seemed to be saying the same thing. He vanished without a trace. Then a break, or at least it looked like one. A man came forward. Nervous, shifting on his feet, he told detectives he saw the missing officer the night he vanished. According to him, the officer wasn't alone. He claimed he saw him near his cruiser, talking to someone. Then, he said, the officer climbed into another car and was driven away. Detectives leaned in. What kind of car? The man paused. First, he said it was a dark sedan. Later, he swore it was a pickup. Then, he wasn't sure at all. The details kept changing. What color? They pressed. He hesitated again, first black, then blue, then maybe gray. Each time detectives returned, his version twisted slightly. Enough to raise hope, but also enough to create doubt. Was he confused, lying, or hiding something? The department kept his statement, but nobody trusted it fully. Still, it was the closest thing they had to a lead. And in a case this cold, even shadows felt worth chasing. As days turned into weeks, a darker idea began to spread. At first, it was only whispers, quiet comments outside the station, murmurs in coffee shops. Then it grew louder. Some people began to wonder if the missing officer had vanished on purpose. Maybe he staged it, one reporter suggested during a live broadcast. Maybe he wanted out. Theories multiplied. Some said he was drowning in debt and ran away to start fresh. Others claimed he had a secret girlfriend and left to be with her. A few even whispered he might have been living a double life, hiding something so big that disappearing was his only way out. The family hated it. His mother snapped at cameras. My son would never abandon us. Never. His father stood silent, but his eyes burned with anger. For them, the rumors weren't just lies. They were an insult to his name. Inside the department, the rumors hurt too. Officers felt divided. Some were sure he had been taken. Others admitted, quietly, that maybe he walked away. If anyone wanted to vanish, leaving a cruiser running would make it look like an abduction, one detective muttered. The press latched onto the theory. Headlines shifted from officer missing to did he run. Talk radio callers debated it endlessly. Cops are people too, one said. Maybe he cracked. Another argued, no way. If he was in trouble, he would have asked for help. Every new theory chipped away at the clean image of the young officer. Friends defended him, saying he was honest. reliable, the last person who'd ever abandoned his badge. But the rumors kept spreading, like smoke no one could contain. For detectives, the pressure doubled. If he staged it, they had to prove it. If he didn't, they had to find who did this. Either way, doubt had entered the case. And doubt is poison. Detectives turned to the facts. They pulled his bank records, phone logs, and work files. If he had planned to disappear, the evidence would show it. Money transfers, withdrawals, calls to someone secret, anything unusual. But the accounts looked normal. Small grocery purchases, gas for the car, a phone call to his parents the night before, a routine deposit from his paycheck. Nothing stood out. Detectives went through his locker at the station. Everything was neat. His spare uniform hung pressed. His boots were lined up. Notes from his last cases were clipped in order. It looked like a man planning to come back the next day, not a man preparing to vanish. They checked his work record too. No complaints, no suspensions, just solid, steady service. If he had a secret life, it was invisible. For investigators, the rumors of escape were losing ground. The paper trail told a different story. He was living normally, right up until the night he disappeared. And that made his sudden vanishing even harder to explain. With no clear answers from the streets or his records, detectives turned to the people who knew him best. They started with his closest friends on the force. In interview rooms, one by one, fellow officers sat across the table. Some spoke with confidence. He was happy, proud to wear the badge, always cracking jokes before roll call. But others weren't so certain. One officer hesitated, then said quietly, he seemed stressed lately, tired, like something was weighing on him. Detectives pressed. Did he talk about it? Did he mention problems? The answers were vague. One remembered him saying he couldn't trust everyone. Another recalled him being quieter than usual in the weeks before he vanished. But none of it was solid. They moved on to civilian friends, high school buddies, neighbors, old coworkers. Most described him as dependable, the type of guy who showed up when he said he would. He wouldn't run away, one insisted. Still, cracks appeared. A neighbor recalled him packing outside late at night, smoking, even though he usually didn't. Another mentioned he'd been spending long hours at work, coming home exhausted, avoiding questions. Detectives asked about relationships. Was he seeing anyone? Was there trouble at home? A few friends shrugged. Some said no. Others hinted at possible arguments, though none had proof. The interviews built a confusing picture. To some, he was steady, happy, and proud. To others, he seemed troubled, even secretive. Back at the station, detectives pinned notes to the board. Statements overlapped, contradicted, tangled into a web. Was he a man living normally, or was he hiding something? The uncertainty only deepened the mystery. For the department, it was unsettling. If his own friends couldn't agree on who he was in those final weeks, how could anyone figure out what happened to him? The questions grew heavier. The answers remained out of reach. Weeks passed, then months, and with each passing day the trail grew colder. At first the case had been buzzing with energy. Detectives worked around the clock. Every tip, every lead, no matter how small, was chased down. But over time, the excitement and urgency started to fade. There were no new clues, no new witnesses, nothing that could explain where the missing officer had gone. Detectives who once burned with determination were slowly reassigned to other cases. The department had murders, robberies, and fresh crimes that needed attention. Eventually, the missing officer's file was no longer on the front desk. It was placed on a shelf, then in a box, then in storage. Inside those boxes were hundreds of pages. Interview transcripts, photographs, maps of search zones, and handwritten notes filled with hope that had gone nowhere. For the family, it felt like betrayal. They had expected answers or at least progress. Instead, all they got was silence. The officer's parents begged for updates. His friends left messages, but most of the time the phone calls weren't even returned. It was as if the man had vanished from the earth, and now, slowly, he was vanishing from people's minds too. Every once in a while, a new detective would pull out the files, skim the papers, and make a few calls. But after days of trying, they would end up where everyone else had stuck. The case was officially open, but in truth, It was cold, and that coldness spread like a shadow over the town, over the family, and over every person who still cared. 2 years after the officer vanished, hope seemed gone. But then, one day, a call came in. A hunter walking through a dense patch of woods about 15 miles from town spotted something caught on a thorn bush. At first he thought it was just trash, but when he got closer his stomach dropped. It was a jacket. Not just any jacket, a police jacket. Dark blue, torn at the sleeve and weather-beaten from the elements. The hunter called it in, and soon the woods were swarming with officers. Some whispered, "This has to be his. We finally found something." The jacket was carefully bagged and sent to the crime lab. For a brief moment, it felt like everything had shifted. Maybe this was the break they had been waiting for. Maybe now they could trace where he went, or how far he got before something happened. Families clung to the hope. Reporters swarmed the station, demanding updates. Detectives braced themselves for what could finally be an answer. But then came the results. The jacket didn't belong to him. It had nothing to do with the missing officer. Forensics showed it had been left in the woods years before. DNA testing pointed to someone else entirely. That discovery crushed the small flame of hope. To the family, it felt like another cruel joke. To the detectives, it was another dead end. And to the town, it was a reminder that no matter how much they wanted closure, the truth was still hidden. The jacket was placed in evidence, tagged and stored away. Another false lead. Another weight added to a case already drowning in disappointment. And once again, the darkness closed in. It was a slow afternoon at the station when the phone rang. The desk sergeant picked up, expecting a routine call. Instead, a shaky voice on the other end said something that made him sit up straight. The caller claimed they had seen the missing officer, not just recently, but alive, and across the border in Mexico. The details came fast. The caller described a man sitting alone at a roadside cafe in a border town. He looked tired, thinner than before, but unmistakable. Same sharp jawline, same hair. Even the way he carried himself, the caller said, was exactly like the officer. The tip was logged, and within hours detectives were scrambling. For so long they had been chasing ghosts. Finally, here was something solid. If true, it meant the officer hadn't been killed. He had walked away. Teams were dispatched. Calls were made to Mexican authorities. Flyers with the officer's picture were passed around. Detectives even drove down, crossing the same border the caller mentioned, hoping to find the man. For days, energy surged back into the case. The family clung to the possibility. Could it be true? Had he started a new life in secret? Was he running from debt, danger, or some hidden part of himself no one knew about? But as fast as the lead appeared, it fell apart. Detectives checked every cafe in that town. They showed his picture to waiters, clerks, and locals. No one had seen him. Cameras, where they existed, showed nothing. When they traced the caller, things got worse. The person who phoned in couldn't be pinned down. Their story changed with every interview. First, they swore it was him. Then they admitted they weren't so sure. Eventually, they stopped answering calls altogether. The Mexico lead was a bust, another false hope. For detectives, it felt like running headfirst into a wall. For the family, it was another knife in the heart. And once again, the officer remained gone, his name now tied to rumors, but still without truth. Behind closed doors, the mood shifted. For years, detectives had told the family the same thing. "We're doing everything we can. We'll find him. Don't give up hope." But after countless dead ends, the jacket, the Mexico call, and dozens of other false tips, the whispers inside the department grew darker. Some officers admitted privately what they would never say on the record. They believed he was dead. They reasoned it out in hushed voices. If he had wanted to disappear, he would have left some sign. Money missing, a secret bank account, something. But there had been nothing. His life had been clean, normal, steady. That left only one explanation: something terrible had happened. Morale dropped. Detectives rotated onto the case, took one look at the mountain of failed leads, and quietly told each other, "There's nothing left to chase." For the family, the silence from the department grew louder. Every time the phone rang, they prayed it was news. Most of the time it was. Hope was still alive, at least in public. But in the private corners of the squad room, belief had shifted. They didn't think he was missing anymore. They thought he was gone. As the case dragged on, not everyone believed the story was so simple. Inside the department, quiet voices began to whisper. They wondered if the truth wasn't out on the streets at all, but inside their own building. It started with little things. Notes in the case file that went missing, tips that were logged late or not at all, a rumor that a key piece of evidence had been found near the car but was never tested. None of it could be proven, but once the idea of a cover-up started, it spread like wildfire. Some officers suggested the department didn't want to admit failure. After all, how could a police officer vanish in the middle of Denver, on duty, and no one know a thing? The longer the case went unsolved, the more embarrassing it became. Maybe, some thought, higher-ups were burying leads to protect the department's image. Others took it further. They whispered about corruption. Denver in the 1980s had its share of scandals, drugs moving through the city, gangs paying off insiders, even rumors of dirty cops. Could the missing officer have stumbled onto something he shouldn't have? Maybe he saw or learned something that made him a target not from strangers, but from people he worked with. For the family, these whispers were torture. They trusted the police. But every time a detective rotated off the case, every time promises were made and then forgotten, doubt crept in. What if the very people sworn to protect him were hiding the truth? Publicly, the department dismissed all of it. Leaders stood at podiums and said the same lines. "We will never stop searching. Every lead is being followed." But behind the scenes, morale was broken. Detectives were exhausted. The file was thicker than ever, yet progress was non-existent. And those whispers, that maybe the answers were sitting in the department's own hallways, never really went away. At first, the case had dominated Denver. His face was everywhere: newspapers, television, radio. Every night, families saw his smile on the evening news. Every morning, his name was in the headlines. But as the years passed, other stories pushed him aside. A new crime wave, political scandals, big sports events. Life kept moving forward. News stations couldn't keep repeating the same story with no answers. Gradually, the officer's name appeared less and less. By the 5th year, coverage had nearly vanished. The only time his picture appeared was on anniversaries, usually in a quick segment reminding viewers that he was still gone. For the public, he became just another mystery. Denver was a city with plenty of crime. People shook their heads, said, "What a shame," and moved on. For the family, the silence was crushing. They had once been surrounded by support: strangers dropping off food, neighbors leaving flowers, reporters asking for updates. Now, the calls had stopped. The crowds had vanished. It felt like the city had forgotten him. The department still kept the case open, at least on paper, but even that felt hollow. Detectives rotated in, skimmed the old files, then left. No new answers came. At family gatherings, his chair sat empty. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Life moved forward, but their pain stayed frozen in time. The world outside treated him like a memory. But for those closest to him, every single day was a reminder. He was still missing, and no one seemed to care anymore. When the police slowed down, the family sped up. They could not accept that the trail had gone cold. To them, their son, their brother, their father, he wasn't a file in a box. He was real. He was missing, and they would not stop looking for him. So they began their own search. At first, it was small. The mother made phone calls, sometimes to strangers, sometimes to reporters who had once covered the story. She begged them to bring his case back into the spotlight. Most of the time, the answer was polite but final. "Sorry, no updates. No space for it on the news." The father went in another direction. He drove to neighborhoods where rumors had placed his son. He would knock on doors, ask strangers if they had seen anything years ago. Most shook their heads. A few said they remembered the case but had nothing useful to add. But every so often, someone would tell a story: a shadow they thought they saw, a car parked where it shouldn't have been, a rumor of a fight. The father wrote it all down. Even if it led nowhere, it was something. The siblings, too, played their part. At school and later in their own lives, they passed out flyers, even long after police had stopped printing them. They begged people to remember. They hoped that maybe, just maybe, someone out there still knew the truth. Sometimes they chased rumors across the state. A truck stop worker said he thought he saw the missing officer late one night. The family drove hours, only to find it was a dead end. Another time, a woman swore she met a man in New Mexico who looked exactly like him. Again, the family packed into a car, hearts racing. Again, nothing. The disappointment was brutal. Each lead carried hope. Each dead end crushed it, but they refused to stop. Neighbors started calling them desperate. Even friends who had once stood with them at vigils began to drift away. People said the family was holding onto ghosts, that it was time to move on. But for them, moving on was impossible. The mother kept his room the same. His clothes hung in the closet. His badge photo sat on the nightstand. Every night before bed, she whispered his name, praying he could somehow hear her. The father grew harder, quieter. He rarely spoke about feelings, but his actions told the story. Every weekend, he was out somewhere, digging through old records, knocking on new doors, driving down lonely roads chasing shadows. Even when the city forgot, the family refused to let the world forget. They wrote letters to newspapers, begged talk shows to cover the case, even showed up unannounced at the police station to demand updates. Sometimes detectives rolled their eyes. Sometimes they promised to call. Sometimes they didn't even bother. But none of it stopped the family. They were tired, they were hurting, but they were not finished. Because deep down they believed one thing: the truth was out there. And as long as they kept searching, there was still a chance to find it. The cameras focus on her face. She sits stiff in the chair, both hands wrapped around a framed photo of her son in uniform. The bright lights are harsh, but she doesn't notice. All she sees is the lens, the people watching at home, and the slim chance that someone out there knows the truth. Her plea is simple. "Bring him back," she whispers. Her voice cracks on the last word. For a moment it seems like she might break down, but she refuses. She stares straight ahead, fighting the tears. The reporters stay silent. Some shift uncomfortably, but no one interrupts. She continues. "He is a good son. He loves his job. He would never just leave. Please, if you know anything, please tell us. We just want him home." Across Denver, families are eating dinner, kids are doing homework, TVs flicker in living rooms. People stop what they're doing. They see her pain, her strength, her desperation. Call centers light up. Tips pour in. Most are worthless, some are cruel, but her words reach people. For the first time since his disappearance, the case feels real to the public. Not just a headline, a family's nightmare. The father doesn't do interviews. He doesn't like the cameras, the lights, or the reporters shouting questions. But he stands there anyway. Every press conference, he's next to the detectives, arms crossed, jaw tight. He doesn't speak much. When he does, his words are short, heavy. "We just want answers. Find my son." But his eyes say more than his mouth ever could. There's anger there, anger at whoever took his son, and anger at how little progress has been made. There's doubt too. Doubt that the system, the department, the people standing beside him are telling him everything. Detectives talk about leads, about working around the clock. Cameras flash. The father doesn't flinch. He doesn't clap or nod. He just stands silent, staring straight ahead. Reporters write about his strength. Neighbors say he looks unshakable. But at night, when the cameras are gone, his silence is different. It's not strength. It's heartbreak, heavy and endless. At school, the officers' younger brothers and sisters feel the weight of the mystery. They can't escape it. In hallways, whispers follow them. "That's his brother. Do you think he ran away?" Some kids are cruel. They say things no child should hear. Maybe he didn't like his family. Maybe he's dead. The siblings don't answer. They keep their heads down, but the words sink deep. Even teachers struggle. Some avoid the subject completely, afraid to say the wrong thing. Others try, but their words sound hollow. "He'll come back, you'll see." Every day is a reminder. The missing posters on walls, the looks from neighbors, the silence at home. They don't just lose a brother, they lose normal life. The siblings carry that silence everywhere. It sits at the dinner table, on the playground, and in every classroom. No answers, just pain. When weeks turn into months, the family decides to hold vigils. On a cold night in Denver, hundreds of people gather in a park. Everyone holds candles, their flames small against the wind. The crowd is quiet. Some pray, some sing, some just stand in silence. At the front, the family stands together. The mother grips the framed photo again. The father's arms are crossed, his face hard. The siblings hold hands, leaning on each other. Songs echo in the dark. A pastor speaks about faith, about holding on to hope. Then names are called out, the officer's name, repeated by dozens of voices, filling the air like a plea. Tears roll down faces. Strangers hug. Reporters capture the moment, their cameras flashing in the night. For a few hours, the family doesn't feel alone. The city seems to stand with them. But when the candles burn out, when the crowd goes home, the silence returns. The officer is still missing. The family is still waiting. Behind closed doors, new questions begin to spread. At first, people whispered that maybe the officer was taken by a stranger. But as time went on, the talk changed. Some asked quietly, did he have enemies? Neighbors wondered if he was mixed up in something dangerous. Former coworkers hinted at arguments, tensions, things never spoken about in public. And then, the most chilling rumor. Maybe the danger wasn't outside the department at all. Maybe it was inside. The family heard every word. They tried to ignore it, but it grew louder. Whispers crept into conversations at church, in grocery stores, at the gas station. People would stop mid-sentence when a family member walked by. Each rumor felt like a knife. They didn't know what to believe. Was something being hidden from them? Had his own brothers in uniform betrayed him? The questions haunted them as much as his absence. Every holiday became a test of pain. At Thanksgiving, the family set a plate for him at the table. No one touched it. No one moved it. It sat there, a silent reminder of the empty chair. On Christmas morning, gifts were wrapped and placed under the tree with his name on them. Year after year, they remained unopened. The siblings stared at them, not knowing if it was hope or denial keeping them there. Birthdays were the hardest, a cake with his name, candles lit, but no one to blow them out. The family sang anyway, voices breaking. Neighbors sometimes joined, bringing food, trying to fill the gap. But nothing worked. His absence was louder than anything else in the room. Traditions that once brought joy now only hurt. Yet the family refused to stop them. To stop would mean letting go. And letting go was unthinkable. His absence was everywhere. Years pass, but the family refuses to let the case fade away. Every few months they call reporters. Sometimes the reporters answer politely, sometimes they don't. Most of the time the answer is the same. No new leads, no updates. But the family keeps calling anyway. They press detectives too. They drive to the station, walk right up to the front desk, and demand to know what's happening. Sometimes they get a meeting, sometimes just a few empty words. They leave angry but more determined. Posters go up again, not just in Denver but in nearby towns. The same photo of him in uniform, the same desperate plea. People rip some down, others ignore them, but the family keeps replacing them. At home, the siblings argue sometimes. One says it's time to accept he might be gone. Another explodes. We can't. If we stop, then he's really dead. The parents never stop. Every holiday, every vigil, every interview request, they show up. They say his name again and again, making sure the world remembers. To outsiders, it looks like denial. To the family, it's survival. They will not let him become just another unsolved case, lost in a file box. Not their son, not their brother. On the edge of Denver, an old barn sat hidden behind weeds and rusted fences. For years, it was nothing more than a broken-down shell. Its roof sagged, its wood split, and most people forgot it was even there. But one day, a construction crew rolled in. The land had been sold and the barn was marked to come down. Bulldozers, trucks, and men with hard hats lined up outside. Their job was simple: clear the land and make way for new buildings. As the machines roared to life, dust rose into the air. Wood cracked and fell as the first walls came crashing down. The barn groaned like it was fighting against being torn apart. Boards splintered, nails flew, and the once forgotten building was reduced to rubble piece by piece. The crew worked fast, hauling out broken beams and sweeping through piles of dirt. It was just another job for them, another old structure being erased from the map. But deep inside the barn, beneath its rotted floor, something waited. something that had been buried for years, hidden away where no one would think to look. The workers had no idea that in a few hours, they were about to uncover the first real clue in a mystery that had haunted a family for over a decade. After most of the barn was torn down, a few workers stayed behind to clear the ground. The floor was nothing but dirt, packed hard from years of weight above it. One man swung his shovel into the ground, scooping up clumps of earth. It was routine dig, toss, repeat. But then the blade of his shovel hit something solid. The sharp metal clanged against it with a dull sound, not like rock, not like wood. Something different. The worker stopped and leaned down. He brushed away the dirt with his gloves, expecting to see an old pipe or maybe a chunk of concrete left behind from a repair. But what he uncovered wasn't flat like stone. It curved, smooth, round. Another worker joined him, kneeling down in the dust. Together they dug carefully, their hands pulling away soil bit by bit. The more they cleared, the stranger it became. This wasn't junk or scrap. It had shape. It had weight. At first, they thought it might be an old piece of farm equipment, but as more dirt came off, the outline became clearer. This was no machine. This was something different, something that didn't belong under a barn. The men exchanged nervous looks. A quiet tension spread through the group. They knew this wasn't normal. One of them muttered that they should call the foreman. By now, a few other workers had gathered around, staring down at the strange object poking through the dirt. Every scoop of soil made the mystery grow. The round surface gleamed faintly beneath the sunlight, as if it had been waiting to be seen. And when the workers finally stepped back, the shape that remained half buried in the dirt sent a chill through the air. They hadn't just found something hard. They had found the beginning of an answer. The workers pressed their hands deeper into the dirt, trying to figure out what they had struck. One man's fingers caught on something soft. He pulled, expecting it to be a rag, maybe an old tarp left behind. But when the dirt shook loose, it wasn't thin like paper or fragile like rotted cloth. It was heavy, thick, dark in color. The crew crouched around as the worker tugged harder. A patch of fabric slid free, caked in soil but strangely intact. They expected it to crumble in their hands, but instead it held together, tough, almost like it had been waiting all this time beneath the ground. Someone muttered, "That's not normal." Another man frowned, saying maybe it was just a blanket or a worker's jacket that got buried years ago. But as they spread it out, brushing more dirt off the seams, the truth became harder to ignore. This wasn't trash, this was clothing, and not just any clothing, it looked official. The fabric was thick enough to withstand years in the earth, dark in color, like navy or black, with edges that hinted at something more than everyday wear. The workers traded looks, each man silently realizing what it might mean. Was this part of a uniform? No one wanted to say it out loud, but the thought hung heavy in the air. What was a uniform doing here, buried under an old barn? And more importantly, where was the person it belonged to? The men worked faster now, pulling at more cloth, uncovering folds of fabric pressed tight by the soil. What they were seeing no longer felt like just some forgotten junk. It felt deliberate, hidden, and wrong. And whatever was buried here wasn't finished revealing itself. As the dirt came away, something small caught the sunlight. One worker froze, leaning closer. A glint of metal shone through the soil. At first it looked like a button, round, dull, but still shining after years underground. They brushed it clean, and the outline of another button appeared, still attached to the fabric. That's when the crew fell silent. Buttons meant clothing, real clothing, and the kind of heavy buttons they were staring at didn't belong to a blanket or coat. These were the kind used on uniforms. A second glint broke the dirt sharper, brighter. One of the workers scraped away with his gloves and a shape began to form. Not round this time, flat, etched. It was a badge. The crew froze. No one spoke. For a moment, all you could hear was the sound of the wind rattling through the broken barn. The badge sat there, half buried, its emblem still visible under the dirt. This was no accident, no mistake. They weren't uncovering junk, they were uncovering evidence. One man stepped back, his face pale. Another whispered, "We need to call someone." The group knew exactly what they had stumbled on, and they also knew it meant their job site had just turned into something far bigger. With every button, every piece of fabric, and now the badge glinting in the sunlight, the truth was undeniable. Someone had buried a police uniform under this barn, and that could only mean one thing. What came next was going to be far worse. Within an hour, the barn was no longer a construction site. It was a crime scene. Patrol cars lined the dirt road, lights flashing against the broken wood of the old structure. Yellow crime tape stretched across the property, cutting off the curious neighbors who had started gathering nearby. Detectives ducked under the tape and hurried toward the workers who had made the discovery. The men stood off to the side, their faces pale, still shaken by what they had pulled from the ground. On the dirt floor of the barn, the fabric and badge lay where the crew had uncovered them. Detectives dropped to their knees, pulling on gloves, carefully brushing soil away with small tools in their hands. The more they cleared, the clearer it became. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. The dirt held something organized, clothing folded, pressed by the weight of the earth. And in the middle of it, that badge. One detective stopped and just stared. Another leaned in close, his face tense. The sight became quiet, except for the careful scraping of brushes and the clicking of cameras. Every detail was documented, every angle photographed. The workers had uncovered something that was never meant to be found. And now, detectives knew they were on the edge of uncovering the truth of a missing officer. As the dirt fell away from the badge, the detectives leaned closer. The metal was scratched, dulled by years underground, but the numbers stamped across it were still clear. The lead detective froze. His lips moved silently as he read the sequence. He looked at another officer nearby, who nodded slowly, his face draining of color. They didn't need to check a database. They didn't need to run the number through the system. Every cop in Denver already knew whose badge this was. It belonged to the officer who had vanished 8 years earlier. A heavy silence swept through the barn. Detectives exchanged glances, their expressions tight. This wasn't just evidence. This was confirmation. The badge number was proof. One officer stepped outside and made the call. Others stood still, the reality sinking in. For nearly a decade, the department had chased rumors, false leads, and dead ends. Now, in a forgotten barn on the outskirts of town, the truth had finally broken through the dirt. Shock rippled through the department. Word spread fast. Phones rang. Radios buzzed. Officers whispered the same thing again and again. His badge had been found. And with it, the case that had gone cold was suddenly alive again. Detectives stared at the uniform as the last of the dirt was brushed away. The fabric was intact, surprisingly preserved by the soil. The badge sat on top, gleaming faintly under the work lights. But there was something missing, something everyone expected to find. There was no body. The hole in the barn floor showed only earth, fabric, and metal. No bones, no remains, nothing to prove what had really happened on that night 8 years ago. The uniform had been folded neatly, placed with care. This wasn't a careless burial. This was deliberate. Someone wanted it hidden. Someone wanted it found only if the ground was ever broken open again. Detectives traded uneasy glances. The discovery gave them the first solid connection in years. It confirmed the missing officer had never simply walked away. His badge and uniform had been placed underground for a reason. But without a body, they couldn't say how he died. They couldn't say who had done it. And they couldn't say why the uniform had been buried in a barn on the edge of Denver. For the family, for the department, the uniform was both an answer and a terrifying new mystery. Detectives didn't just stop at the uniform. They began digging into the history of the barn itself. Property records showed that years earlier, it had been owned by someone the department knew well, a former Denver police officer. The man had retired suddenly, almost overnight. On paper, it looked like he had left on his own terms. But the deeper detectives looked, the more troubling it became. Rumors from the time painted a different picture. He had been whispered about inside the department for years. Some said he was involved in misconduct. Others believed he had ties to missing evidence, especially drugs that had been seized during raids but never logged properly. Nothing had ever been proven, but the cloud around him never lifted. Now detectives couldn't ignore the connection. His property was the exact place where the missing officer's uniform had been found. buried under the barn floor. The retired officer had sold the land and moved away long before the discovery, but the timing lined up. He left the department only months after the young officer vanished. That detail sent a chill through everyone working the case. This was no coincidence. It was the first solid link pointing inside law enforcement. Detectives canvassed the area around the barn. At first, neighbors didn't remember much. It had been years, but as questions pressed, old memories began to surface. One woman remembered headlights pulling into the barn's driveway late at night. The engines cut off, but shadows moved inside. She thought it was odd, but back then, she assumed it was just storage or repairs. Another neighbor recalled hearing raised voices echoing from the barn on more than one occasion. Arguments, angry tones, but never clear enough to make out the words. A farmer down the road said he noticed lights flickering through the cracks in the barn's wood, sometimes after midnight. To him, it looked like people were meeting inside when no one was supposed to be there. None of them had ever reported it. Back then, it seemed like nothing. But now, with detectives listening carefully, every detail took on new weight. The barn had not been just an empty building. It had been active. Something had gone on inside those walls, something secret, something dark. For investigators, the whispers from the neighbors connected perfectly with the timeline of the officer's disappearance. Detectives didn't stop at the stories. They turned to science. Forensics teams moved in on the barn, scooping out soil and carefully studying every layer. What they found was chilling. Tests on the dirt around the uniform showed clear markers of when it had been buried. Tiny changes in soil composition, moisture, and insect activity gave investigators a timeline. The results were precise. The uniform had been buried only days after the officer vanished back in 1994. This finding crushed one possible theory, that maybe the uniform had been hidden years later as some kind of cruel trick. The science said otherwise. Whoever buried it had done so almost immediately after the disappearance. That fact changed everything. It meant the barn wasn't just connected to the case. It had been part of the crime itself. The placement of the uniform, folded neatly, badge tucked inside, felt deliberate. Someone hadn't simply thrown it into the dirt. They had taken time, pushing it deep, covering it carefully, and making sure it wouldn't surface. Detectives knew then, this wasn't a random dumping site. It was part of a cover-up, a secret meant to stay buried forever. Just when detectives thought they had exhausted every lead, a break came from an unexpected source. A neighbor who had stayed silent for years finally stepped forward. She had been a teenager at the time of the officer's disappearance, living just down the road from the barn. Her story stunned investigators. On the very night the officer vanished, she swore she saw a patrol car parked near the barn. It wasn't unusual to see police vehicles in the city, but out here, on a lonely dirt road, it stood out. She remembered slowing her bike as she passed. The headlights were off, but the car was unmistakably a marked cruiser. Fear had kept her quiet all those years. She worried no one would believe her, or worse, that speaking out could bring her trouble. But with the discovery of the uniform, she felt she had to talk. Her testimony gave detectives the missing puzzle piece. The officer hadn't vanished into thin air. He had been lured or taken straight to that barn. Detectives dug into the barn's past owner, the former officer who had retired suddenly. His file raised eyebrows. Years earlier, he had been accused of mishandling evidence. Rumors swirled about stolen drug money and missing property from busts, but nothing was ever proven. He left the force quietly, without charges, and disappeared from the spotlight. Now, old records began to show troubling patterns. Several officers connected to him during his career had also faced internal investigations. A few had been accused of skimming money during raids or looking the other way on shady deals. Some of those names still appeared in department rosters. The barn owner wasn't just some retired cop living in peace. He was part of a circle that had shadows hanging over them. Detectives noticed another link. When the officer vanished, he had been scheduled to testify in an internal hearing about missing funds. That hearing involved names connected directly to the barn's owner. It was no longer coincidence. The barn wasn't simply where his uniform was buried. It was tied to men with power, secrets, and plenty of reasons to stay quiet. Piece by piece, detectives began to reconstruct the night of the disappearance. The uniform buried in the dirt, the patrol car seen parked nearby, and the barn's suspicious history all pointed in one direction. The officer hadn't randomly gone missing. He had been brought to that barn. Phone records showed he had received calls from fellow officers shortly before he disappeared. Nothing in the log seemed unusual at first. It looked like regular check-ins. But detectives noticed one call came from a number tied to the retired officer's family. The theory formed quickly. The missing officer was likely lured to the barn under false pretenses. He trusted the people calling him. They were colleagues, maybe even friends. To him, showing up didn't feel like a trap. But once inside, something went wrong. The barn wasn't just a meeting spot. It was the place where trust ended and betrayal began. The investigation reached a breaking point. Detectives could no longer avoid the truth staring back at them. The missing officer hadn't been ambushed by a stranger. He hadn't run away. He had been set up. Phone records, witness statements, and the buried uniform all pointed in one direction, inside the badge. Someone in law enforcement, someone he trusted, had called him to that barn, and once he arrived, he never walked out. It was the worst fear for any department. Betrayal not from criminals on the street, but from their own. Detectives spread out files across a long table. Old reports, interview transcripts, and fresh forensic results filled the surface. For years, the pieces hadn't fit, but now, with the barn discovery, everything began to click into place. The missing officer wasn't just another patrolman. Before he vanished, he had quietly started asking questions inside the department. He noticed missing evidence in reports. He noticed cash from drug busts that didn't add up. His notes showed he was pulling on a thread, and that thread led straight to his own colleagues. Witness testimony now matched the timeline. The night he vanished, calls came from officers linked to corruption rumors. A neighbor had spotted a patrol car near the barn, and the forensics proved the uniform was buried right after he went missing. The conclusion was no longer guesswork. This was targeted. The officer had stepped too close to exposing something big, and instead of protection, he was silenced. For detectives, it was like a curtain finally lifting. What once looked like random mystery was now a carefully planned betrayal. The barn was not just a burial site. It was the scene of a cover-up years in the making. The files revealed something chilling. The young officer had been carrying evidence. Weeks before his disappearance, he had logged missing amounts from several drug seizures. The numbers didn't match the official reports. Thousands of dollars had disappeared, and it wasn't hard to guess where it went. He wrote down everything in his personal notebook. He also made copies of a few reports. His closest friends later said he had talked about going to the right people with what he found. But he wasn't careful. He shared too much with the wrong colleagues, men who were part of the very corruption he was about to report. Detectives traced his movements in his final days. He met with one supervisor privately. He called another officer late at night. He thought he was building trust, but in reality, word of his discovery spread fast. Instead of support, he signed his own death warrant. His notes, his reports, and his willingness to speak out made him a target. The men around him had too much to lose, and they decided to stop him before he could say another word. The trap was simple, and it worked because he trusted them. Phone records proved he got calls from fellow officers on the night he disappeared. They told him to meet them out near the barn. It was phrased as a duty call, something urgent, something only he could help with. For a young officer, answering that call felt natural. He put on his uniform, kissed his family goodbye, and drove out without question. He thought he was helping his own team. He had no idea he was driving straight into a setup. The barn was perfect for their plan. Remote, quiet, and tied to someone already linked to shady deals. Once he walked inside, there was no way out. The uniform buried in the dirt later showed how fast it happened. Detectives now understood. He didn't stumble into danger. He was brought there on purpose by people he believed were his brothers in blue, and once the trap closed, his voice was silenced forever. The betrayal cut deeper because it wasn't strangers or criminals. It was his own. The barn was quiet. Dust covered the wooden beams and the air smelled of hay and oil. Investigators now believed this was where the officer's final moments happened. He had come there expecting to help, expecting to serve. But instead, he walked straight into a trap. He likely thought he was meeting other officers for a quick duty call. Maybe he expected to check on a stolen vehicle or look into a lead. But the reality was far darker. He wasn't surrounded by strangers. He was surrounded by men he trusted, men who wore the same badge. Detectives pieced it together. The officer never stood a chance. If he walked into that barn and the doors shut behind him, he would have been outnumbered and confused. One wrong look, one wrong question, and the truth he carried was too dangerous for them to allow. The betrayal cut deeper than anything else. These were not criminals from the street. They were brothers in uniform, men who had shared meals, patrol cars, and long shifts, and they chose silence and greed over loyalty. The officer had been silenced in the shadows, hidden away in the very place meant to symbolize safety. What happened inside those walls was brutal, but also calculated. No body was ever found, because the people behind it knew exactly what they were doing. For detectives, the hardest truth was realizing that the badge, the thing meant to protect, had been used to destroy. The barn wasn't just a hiding place. It was a stage for betrayal, one that had stayed secret for nearly a decade. When the uniform was uncovered, detectives at first thought it was just buried evidence. But the more they studied the case, the clearer it became. This wasn't random. This was intentional. The uniform was folded, hidden, and left deep in the ground for someone to eventually find. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. The people who buried it wanted others to know what had happened, but they also wanted fear. For anyone thinking of speaking out, the meaning was simple. This is what happens when you cross us. The uniform represented the officer, even if his body was gone. It was a ghostly reminder of what silence could cost. Detectives saw it as a chilling kind of warning, the kind that didn't need words. Officers in that department would have whispered about his disappearance. Some would have wondered what happened. And when rumors spread about the uniform, the point was made. Don't ask questions. Don't dig too deep. The folded cloth, the badge still attached, and the location, a barn tied to one of their own, all pointed to the same conclusion. It wasn't just disposal. It was theater. To investigators, this explained why no one had ever spoken up in all those years. Fear kept mouths shut. The uniform worked better than any threat. It made sure the officer's silence lasted, and that others stayed quiet too. But instead of killing the truth, the uniform became the key. By leaving it behind, the men who betrayed him left their own secret exposed. And now, detectives had proof that his disappearance wasn't random. It was deliberate, it was staged, and it was meant to scare. When detectives finally sat with the officer's family, the room was heavy with silence. They had waited 8 long years for answers. And now, the truth was more painful than they imagined. The lead detective spoke slowly. He explained that their son, their brother, their husband, hadn't simply vanished. He had been lured, trapped, and betrayed by people he worked beside. The very department that should have protected him had played a role in his death. The family listened in shock, relief mixed with rage. On one hand, they finally knew. They no longer had to wonder if he had run away or if he had abandoned them. He had been doing his job. He had been standing up for what was right, but that choice had cost him everything. Tears flowed. His mother gripped a photo of him in uniform, shaking her head in disbelief. His wife whispered that she had always known something wasn't right, but she never thought it was this. His children asked the question no one could answer. Why? Detectives admitted the hardest part. Justice might never come. Too much time had passed, too many files had vanished, and too many people had closed ranks. But there was also strength in the truth. The family now understood the danger he faced and the courage he showed. He hadn't been weak. He hadn't been careless. He had been targeted because he carried evidence against corruption. The uniform, the barn, and the betrayal, they all told the same story. And though the ending was tragic, the family could finally stop searching. They could finally face the truth. When the full story came out, the city was shaken to its core. News reports spread quickly, showing the barn, the buried uniform, and the details of a cover-up that had lasted for years. People couldn't believe it. The very officers sworn to protect them had turned against one of their own. Inside the department, the fallout was immediate. Files were pulled, names were questioned, and investigators moved fast. Several officers who had worked during that time were brought in for questioning. Some were arrested, others quietly resigned, unable to face the shame of what they had been part of. The public demanded answers. Protests filled the streets outside the police station. For many in the community, this wasn't just about one man, it was about trust. If corruption could reach this deep, how many other stories had been hidden? How many other voices had been silenced? But through all the anger, one thing finally became clear. The missing officer's name was not forgotten. His reputation was restored. Official statements were released calling him a man of courage, a whistleblower who tried to do the right thing in the face of danger. For his family, hearing those words brought some measure of peace. The doubts, the rumors, and the whispers that had haunted them for years were gone. No one could ever again suggest that he had run away or that he had failed in his duty. The truth showed the opposite. He had stood tall when others stayed silent. Ceremonies were held in his honor. His photograph was placed in the department memorial, alongside fallen officers who had given their lives in the line of duty. Except his sacrifice was different. He hadn't died fighting criminals in the street. He had died fighting corruption from within. And now, the city finally recognized him for what he truly was, a hero. Justice came late, but it came. The men who betrayed him were exposed. The uniform they buried to silence him ended up telling the truth they wanted to hide. For his family, the grief never faded, but they no longer lived in the dark. His name was cleared. His story was told, and the officer was remembered not as someone who vanished, but as someone who was brave enough to stand against corruption, even when it cost him everything. The silence was broken, the truth was revealed, and after years of shadows, justice finally had its voice.